Hello everyone, my name is Loko and welcome to another game of StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm. Today we're going to be taking a look at a game that I played a couple of days ago, and we're going to be talking mainly about tricking your opponent in Zerg vs Zerg. Now the reason why this is even a thing is because in ZVZ there's really a limited amount of options that you can really be going for, and in this game my opponent, you know, gets a little bit upset. He's gonna be doing a little bit of raging as well later on if I'm not mistaken. Because I'm trying to trick my opponent into thinking that I'm doing another build, even though I am opening up with a gasless one, and I will go over that in a little bit. But mainly this is just a pretty solid macro Zerg vs Zerg that is a lot of fun to be watching, at least in my opinion. I actually wanted to make a video about this one for a couple of days, because personally I felt like I was in control for most of this game, and like I said, it was a lot of fun to play. So basically what Zerg vs Zerg is all about is either you go Roaches or you go Mutalisks or you cheese early game. Those are really the only builds that are really a thing. Now obviously you can open up with a pretty quick gas geyser even though you're not going to be cheesing, and you can open up with a pretty quick gas geyser and you are going to be cheesing. It's a little bit of a wonky matchup in general. There are only a couple of builds that are really viable. And if I'm not mistaken, in this game I do open up with a gasless opener, which is alright on this map because most of the time Roaches should be beating Mutalisks because they hit right before Mutalisks come out. So there we go, I already got my 15 spawning pool right there going up, and I'm gonna follow this up with a hatchery on the low ground at 15 supply as well. Now, how can you really make your opponent trick? Or how can you really trick your opponent into thinking something else and thinking that you are going for like a cheese, even though you are going for a macro build order? Now, most of the time this is done by a couple of things. For example, your overlord position. Obviously this is a very subtle thing, but your overlord position will sometimes be noted by your opponent as something that is very cheesy. So for example, if your overlords are right clicked on your opponent's overlords, that's one of the ways your opponents might actually assume that you're going to be cheesing, because it would mean that you know exactly where his overlords are located, and that means you can run Zerglings by without your opponent spotting them. Little tiny things like that really start adding on. On top of that, obviously denying scouting really hard, and some people even pull drones just to deny that one Zergling, so there isn't a drone scout in the main base or a Zergling scout in the main base, and your opponent has absolutely no clue what is going on because you are denying him so hard, which once again makes him assume that something tricky is going on. And there's all these kind of little things that most of the time start adding up together, at least in my experience, that very quickly make your opponent assume that you're going for a build order, even though you are going for the complete opposite. So here we go. I do have my first queen out already. Gonna start my second one, and as you can see, no gas guys have started, so this is indeed a gasless build order. And I'm gonna be sending my Zerglings across the map right now to figure out what my opponent is doing. Now, this is what I was trying to say right here. For example, what my opponent could do right now is make a set of Zerglings, make a queen, and hold them on position, or hold position on the ramp, forcing me to not be able to enter his main base, and thus, you know, basically making me think, alright, my opponent has definitely a chance of going for some sort of all-in, because he seems to be hiding it. And that's exactly what he did right there. So right there, my opponent is already... he's doing something cheeky, okay? I'm feeling a little bit hesitant right now about going for certain builds, because, well, you know, it's a little bit tricky. Now, here's another thing. My opponent is sending in his overlord. I'm actually gonna pause it right here for a second. My opponent is sending in this overlord a little bit too far. And this may seem like a mistake, okay? The way he actually responded to that also may look like a mistake. However, if you look on the minimap, my opponent in the meantime is actually making Zerglings. So what he is trying to do is actually move my queen out on the map, you know, saving the overlord easily because that's not gonna die, and then killing the actual queen. So that's one of these little things. This is also known as a retard magnet. For any of you that have been watching Destiny for the last couple of years, I still quite like the terminology right there. But, you know, I'm gonna be forced to move my queen back right now because I noticed on the minimap, okay, my opponent is doing, you know, a little bit of trickery right there. He's tricking me into thinking that I can pick off that overlord and then he will simply kill my queen. So, little tiny subtle things are extremely important in Zerg vs Zerg, and most of the time when you're watching the pro games, the commentators most of the time will not notice these sort of things, okay? That's not to say that commentators are bad, it's just that, you know, there are very little subtle things that are going on that are just very hard to explain anyway, and very hard to, you know, spot just to begin with. So here we go. I do have a bunch of Zerglings out right now. I do have my Baling Nest in production as well. Actually, no, it's my opponent that's Baling Nest in production, but I'm gonna be sending out my Zerglings right around now across the map. Now, keep in mind, I only just now started my Zerg, or my gas geysers. So another little trick right here. My opponent was trying to poster with a bunch of Zerglings. It looked like he was gonna go for aggression. My queen didn't move out on the map. He decided to stop Zergling production and go back into drone production, okay? To counter his trickery, I decided to make a bunch of Zerglings that are running across the map right now, but I don't even have Zergling speed yet. Zergling speed is, I'm even not gonna get it in this game. And, you know, my Zergling speed isn't even remotely done, and my opponent will assume right now, okay, Zerglings are moving across the map, he's picking off my first Overlord, meaning that he will be able to flood with more and more links without me being aware of it. And my opponent will likely assume right now that there is going to be some sort of aggression coming from my side of the map, but in reality, you know, I only have a couple of slow Zerglings and I'm really not doing all that much. So I'm going to be sending these Zerglings back home. And meanwhile, my opponent is making non-stop Zerglings right now. He did hit a little bit of supply block and he is freaking out, pretty much. So those are the little tiny things that I wanted to talk about in this game, mostly, that will allow you to get an advantage in the early part of the game. As sometimes, you know, sometimes you see those games, you see those pro games, and you're like, well, how the hell did he just get an advantage? Because, you know, they've been playing very, very evenly, you know, and all that really happened was him moving out with like a couple of Zerglings on the map and his overlord positioning, and other than that, really nothing happened at all. The most of the time what happens is that somehow, some way, one player made a little bit too many Zerglings, the other player managed to get a lot of drones out, and therefore the player that was making a lot of drones does get an advantage. Now, right now, I actually hit a little bit of supply block. I did make a couple of overloads right there, but, you know, I'm not macroing all that well. But those are the little tiny things right there that can definitely give you an advantage in Zerg vs Zerg. Now, I'm just going to follow this up with some pretty standard Zerg play. So I do have my +1/+1 in production right now. Got my roach speed coming in as well. And you can see the result of my efforts right there. My opponent just now started the lay. He just now started the roach war. And he just now started an evo chamber. And he doesn't have a third base yet. So all this trickery basically gave me an advantage tech-wise. Not so much economy-wise or unit-wise or supply-wise, but tech-wise, I'm much further ahead right now of upgrading than my opponent. So right now, my opponent has his +1 attack in production, and it's about 10 seconds done, and meanwhile mine is done for 80 seconds. That means that I will have a 70-second timing window, if I want to. I obviously don't have to. I do have a 70-second timing window, which is more than a minute, to deal incredible amounts of damage. Because let's say it's gonna be 20 roaches versus 20 roaches, and one of the roaches is upgraded, or, you know, one side of the roaches is upgraded with +1/+1 and the other roaches aren't upgraded at all. It does make a significant difference, and the other player will easily be able to win that, probably with like 8 roaches or so remaining. So little tiny changes like that really start adding up very quickly. Now I am just gonna go and follow this up with a pretty quick expansion. The reasoning behind that is that my opponent still doesn't have his third base up. So I figured, okay, I will just play it safe, get a bit of an economy advantage. And my opponent is a little bit salty, as you can see right there, about my whole shenanigans and about the whole trickery that we've been trying to do on each other. And it looks like he lost the trickery. And he calls me a cheeser. Not completely sure what that is going on right there. But he's a little bit upset. This will happen every now and then in Zerg vs Zerg. Especially when both players are playing barcode. But that's okay. So I am just gonna follow this up with more and more roaches right now. Got my +1/+1 or my +1/+1 just now finished up as well. And I'm gonna try and do a little bit of moving out right here. But once again, I have no reason to move up this ramp, okay? I don't really want to fight him. Why would I fight him right now? I got my third base coming up. I got an economy advantage very shortly. I already have the tech advantage, so I will just push my lead even further. So this moving out once again on the map made my opponent think that I was gonna try and actually kill him, because he obviously knew that I was gonna go for the +1/+1 timing. But instead, all I did was delay his third base. He wasn't able to make the third base for another minute right there. And meanwhile, while my third base is up and while I'm actually producing 8 drones, or actually, that's my opponent producing 8 drones right there. Well, while I'm actually making a bunch of drones very shortly for my third base, you will see that I will start skyrocketing ahead as far as income goes. Now, the one thing to note right there is that my opponent actually has a third base right here. This is poor scouting on my part, but, you know, that's just something to keep in mind right there in this game. I should have known that for a while. The reason why I wasn't aware of my opponent taking that third base right there in that hidden corner is because pretty much never will you see in Zerg vs Zerg someone expanding towards you. I was very confused about that after playing this game and while playing this game, because I will find out a little bit. I was very confused about that because, well, you know, I wasn't really getting that huge advantage that I was expecting. But I still figured this was a good example game to show you the trickery. Now my opponent does get a little bit upset, like I mentioned. And I tell him, hey, I was doing a gases opener. I wasn't even making Zergling speed. I still don't have it. And he's like, nothing. So, very soon I will be moving across the map. Now keep in mind, even though I'm not really having that big of an economy advantage right now, even though it's 56 hard versus 51, and I'm only just now starting up my third base because I didn't scout that my opponent went for that third. I could have actually killed that earlier on if I would have been aware that that was up. That's a huge mistake by me. But the one advantage that I do still have going right here for me, because of the early game trickery, is that I have +2/+2, and once again, a big timing window right here. My opponent's still 70 seconds for finishing it. I am about to finish it already, which means that I have +2/+2, and my opponent is at +1 attack, okay? +0 armor. So that means that, once again, even though my army isn't as big as his, well, normally it would be if I would have scouted that third base, but even though my army isn't as big as his, my army will still be significantly stronger, simply for the fact that I have a lot more units. So here we go, there will be a big engagement coming in right now. I do have a spy crawler here as well to help out. My opponent has a bunch more roaches than me, but I'm gonna try and set up the concave right here, trying to play as patiently as I possibly can. And I do manage to get a significantly better concave than my opponent. Spy crawler just now rooting in as well, and I will be able to start nuking down my opponent. I do also have the defender's advantage at this point, and I'm gonna start reinforcing with a bunch of Hydralisks right there, and you can see the strength of upgrades, okay? Upgrades right there were a huge difference. He was about 15 or so roaches ahead before that fight started. Right now, it's actually evened up, and I will be able to reinforce with more roaches and Hydralisks as well. And even though the advantage isn't quite there yet, well, I was expecting that I would be able to go kill him right now because my opponent, you know, hit that third base so well. I'm gonna be forced to move back. And right now, I'm getting a little bit confused. I'm like, wait a second. There's absolutely no way that he's gonna have that many units off of 2 bases. And that is when I spot that third base. If I would have seen that right when I had my +1/+1 finishing up, I would have been able to win the game right here. There would have been no way that my opponent would have been able to pick that off. But that's just a pretty big mistake right there on my side. So I am just gonna keep on macroing up. I'm gonna try my very best to just max out at this point and try and kill my opponent when I can. Now, I'm gonna set up once again a huge concave right here. My opponent moving straight towards my army, and my Hydras right now are dealing a ton of damage, okay? Even though there are only a couple, in total right there are 7 Hydralisks out on the map, they will be dealing so much more damage than my roaches do, and my opponent decides to leave the game. So, all in all, a whole lot of trickery going on in this game. My opponent sneaking out of third base, expanding towards me, which is very uncommon. Obviously, the Zerglings moving across the map, him actively denying scouting early part of the game, and all in all, just really trying to outsmart each other, even though in the end it ended up pretty even. Well, once again, because my opponent snuck out that third base and I wasn't aware of it. So hopefully this taught you a little bit more about Zerg vs Zerg. If it did, hit that like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. And then I want to thank you guys all for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile, and I'll see you in the next one.